I love how he says, that's the guy you're going to listen to tonight. As if, like, you've really got a choice, I guess. Well, you have. So you can switch off now if that mental image of a little boy running down the road with dog poo on his pants is a struggle. But anyway, tonight we're looking at this big question. And as we've said all week, we do love to answer your questions. So do text in with the questions. And we'll stop probably about 2/3 of the way through to have a look at some of those questions. So text on in to that number. But we're looking at this subject, skeptical about hope. Is there life after life? It used to be a few years ago that nobody talked about sex. It was a big taboo in society. But of course people did it, but they just didn't talk about it in polite company. Of course that's changed. You know, nowadays it's absolutely fine to talk about sex, it seems just about anywhere. But the thing that you don't talk about, particularly in Western culture, is death. And it's become the new taboo, as it were. You know, if you want to ruin a party, just go in and say, have you thought about your death lately? And it's bound to make the party just go downhill, isn't it? It's not something we talk about. We joke about it. I mean, Woody Allen said, I'm not scared of dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Which is kind of amusing. But actually, why is it that in our culture we don't so often talk about death and what might lie beyond? And perhaps it's because for all our knowledge and for all our advancements in technology and for all our wealth and prosperity, the one thing we still don't have an answer to is death. 1 out of 1 still die. The statistics have remained unmoved down through the centuries. And so it can be a thing of great fear. J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series, said, "My books are largely about death. We're all frightened of it." There's this unspoken fear about death. And although for many of us we hope that it's something on the distant horizon and not something we need to think about, wouldn't it be worth seriously considering actually what might happen and whether there's any possibility of having any certainty on that, if it is something that ultimately all of us will face? Well, what does happen after you die? I guess if we were to do a survey of this room or a survey of Odense, then we could find out probably all sorts of different reactions. You could probably put them in several categories. Some people would say, well, nothing happens when you die. When you die, that's it. You rot. And if you're an atheist or materialist that says that there is nothing more than matter, that would, of course, be your conclusion. There cannot be anything more after death. And so some people say, well, if that's the case, well, you should just live your life now, make the most of it, contribute to society, make a difference, because when you're dead, and that's it. So enjoy life and make the most of it. But it's interesting, because if you look at the philosophers and thinkers that held this opinion and thought about it most consistently, rather than leading to their enjoyment of life, it led them to ultimate despair. Because if death is the end, what is the point of life now? Jean-Paul Sartre was a French existentialist, that was his view, and this is what he said: "Man is a crumpled piece of paper in the rain whose only liberation is death." An utterly futile picture of life. That was his consistent outworking of his view. And in fact, many of his followers took his teaching quite literally and went out and ended their lives. They thought, well, what is the point? Or Bertrand Russell, the atheist philosopher, said, "All the labours of the ages, all the devotion and all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined for extinction in the vast death of the solar system. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." Now that might sound depressing, and it is. But that's the consistent outworking of a view that says ultimately death is the end. Because what is the point? I may pass on my genetics, but hey, will my children's children even remember who I am? I had a shocking moment recently when I realised I didn't know my great-grandparents' names. In fact, I don't even know my granddad's name. He died before I was born, his Christian name. I just didn't know it. We're so easily forgotten. And actually, if ultimately it's not just my life that's going to end, but all of existence that's going to end, what's the point of contributing to society and making a difference? Because, well, it won't make a difference ultimately if everything is going to be destroyed. So that's what some people say. There is nothing after death. But other people say, well, maybe we get another chance. There's reincarnation. Maybe we get to come back and have a second chance, a third chance, however many times you want. And it's a very popular view, in fact increasingly popular in Western Europe today, to say that reincarnation must be true, although it's originally an Eastern worldview idea. Now there's a couple of problems with that. Firstly, is there any way that we could know that this is true, anything more than just wishful thinking? And secondly, if you consistently look at those who hold to reincarnation and the religious systems that brought up this idea, it wasn't really you that comes back. It was just your good and bad that's contributed to the next life. And so the idea that you continue, that you have another go, doesn't really fit with that, as much that we might like to think it. And then other people, of course, say, well, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's paradise, maybe there's heaven, and we hope that if there is something else, it's going to be something better and not something worse. But here's the big question. How do we know? Do you just take your pick? Is it just private ideas? Is it just speculation? Is there any way you can know for sure? And I guess some of us think, well, that's our problem with religion. Religion just comes down to blind faith. It's just take what you like and keep it to yourself because we can't know. But actually, I want to suggest, with the Christian worldview, that's not correct. We can know. And let me try and explain why. I don't know whether you've ever been here. I was here, or there, rather, a year ago. It's the southern tip of Africa, or in fact the south-western tip of Africa, called Cape Point. It's just about 50 kilometres south of Cape Town. And I was there in January, lovely time to be in Cape Town. And I went down to this place and visited and went around. And I was learning a bit about the history of Cape Point. Up until 1497, no one from Europe had ever sailed down the west coast of Africa and beyond this point. This is where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet. The currents and the storms are so violent that it was almost impossible to navigate this in a boat safely and come back alive. But then in 1497, a Portuguese sailor called Vasco da Gama set off from Portugal, unsurprisingly, sailed down the west coast of Africa, but went round this point and beyond, all the way to India and back again. He was the first person to make it back alive. Up until this time, this place was known as the Cape of Storms, because that is what it was. But afterwards, they renamed it to what it's currently known as, the Cape of Good Hope. Why? Because someone had been past it and had come back to tell the story. Someone had conquered this place of fear and storms and come back to say that it could be a place of hope. And the Christian claim is this, that there is one person in all of history that is uniquely qualified to speak about life after death. And it's the one person who, as it were, sailed past death and has come back to tell the story, Jesus Christ. The one uniquely qualified person to speak about this. And so it's the resurrection of Jesus Christ that is the very foundation of all of Christianity's claims, and in particular, its hope. But I guess one of the questions you might be asking is, well, okay, in theory that sounds fine, but how on earth do you expect me, as a 21st century intelligent student here at university, to believe something like that, the resurrection? Nice story, nice myth, nice idea, but true? And for most of us, we're thinking, hang on a minute, that's just too big a cultural or intellectual barrier to overcome. Now, if that is the case, what I would say is that for the first disciples of Jesus, the first followers of Jesus, to believe in the resurrection was no less a cultural or intellectual barrier than it is for us. In fact, it was more so. We might think, well, they were just simple fishermen. They believed in simple things like resurrection. But actually, the opposite is the case. And we know why, because when you read the gospel accounts of the resurrection, Jesus, before his death, has repeatedly said to his followers that he is going to die and he's going to rise again. He says it very explicitly, that he will rise 3 days after his death. And yet Jesus goes to Jerusalem and dies just as he said he was going to. And 3 days later, what do you find happening? Now you might expect, given what Jesus has said to them on several occasions, that what you would expect to find happening would be the disciples get together and say, guys, it's the third day. And you know what Jesus said was going to happen on the third day? Let's get down to the tomb and check it out. But is that what happens? Absolutely not. What happens is the women are going to what they think is to anoint a dead body, and the men are probably still in bed. That's normally where men are, isn't it? But no one is expecting the resurrection, and everyone is utterly shocked by the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus. Why? Because even though Jesus said it was going to happen, they didn't expect it to happen, because it wasn't part of their worldview. Most of the first followers of Jesus started out as Jews. And although they believed in God and some kind of life after death, the idea of God coming as a human being on planet Earth, dying a shameful death at the hands of their hated enemies, and then 3 days later rising again in the middle of history, was no more part of their expectations of what is possible as it is for us. In other words, they didn't believe it because they found it easy. They believed it because they were convinced it was true. See, I meet loads of people who just say, I just can't believe in resurrection. And I say, of course, if you're a materialist and you don't believe in God and you think matter is all there is, resurrection is going to sound pretty weird. But what if the evidence was so compelling? Well, shouldn't it, for the sake of intellectual credibility, cause you to challenge your initial assumptions about what is possible and possibly even rethink them? Well, you say, well, what evidence is there? Well, we haven't got all night, but let's just look at 5 pieces of evidence for the resurrection. And it's interesting because these 5 pieces of evidence are generally agreed upon even by historians and scholars that aren't Christians. So I'm not just cherry-picking the evidence here. So firstly, we know that Jesus died. He was crucified by the Romans under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, and we know that the Romans were very good at killing people. They did it a lot. Crucifixion was a very common activity, and it was very, very effective. Jesus died. There's historical accounts of it, both from within and outside of the Bible. Then secondly, we know Jesus was buried in the tomb of a man called Joseph of Arimathea, one of the ruling council that had, as a whole, condemned Jesus to death. Now, it would be a very strange detail to make up that this man would choose to help bury Jesus if it were not in fact true. No competing accounts exist, and so most scholars think that this is accurate, that Jesus really was buried in this rich man's tomb. And then thirdly, we know that Jesus' tomb was reported empty 3 days after the death of Jesus. Now again, this is fascinating because the people who report that the tomb are empty are all initially women. Well, they stayed women forever actually, they didn't have a sex change, sorry. But the men came later, that's what I'm trying to say. That they were all women that came to the tomb. Now, what you may not know is that in first century culture, the people who would not be regarded as reliable witnesses in a court of law were, women, but you, women. Now, that's not the influence of Christianity, it was just the Roman way that they did things. Now, we would know, of course, that a woman's testimony is just as reliable as a man's, but they didn't hold that in that time. So, just suppose the gospel accounts were being made up. Someone was inventing them. And the biggest claim of all is, of course, the resurrection. Why on earth would you choose, because you could choose, couldn't you, to pick women as the first witnesses? It would seem incredible to the extreme to do that, if in fact it didn't really happen. And so it seems that there really were women that went to the tomb and found it empty. In fact, there's another interesting piece of evidence on this, and that was an inscription that was found on a tablet near Nazareth in northern Israel. And it dates from just after the time of these events. And it's a Roman decree decreeing that grave robbers will be punished by death. Now, historians suggest that that's a rather extreme punishment for what wasn't necessarily such an extreme crime. And it seems as if the news of the resurrection has got to the headquarters in Rome. And this is a case of trying to cover it up or try and sort it out, but just too late. So Jesus' tomb was reported to be empty. That's the third thing. But then the fourth thing is that people claim that they have seen Jesus risen from the dead. Now, this is often explained away as hallucinations. But actually, if you know anything about hallucinations, you'll know they normally happen to certain types of people, they happen at certain times, and they go on for an indefinitely long period of time. But the resurrection appearances happen to lots of different types of people, often at the same time, up to 500 people, and they happen for a period of 40 days and then stopped with no repetition. Quite unlike any form of hallucination that we know about. And these people that had seen Jesus, touched him and met him, were willing to go on and die for what they believed. So that's the fourth thing. And then a final thing is this: the growth of the church in the first century. Christianity didn't explode with growth in the 4th century when Constantine, the Roman emperor, came to power, but it exploded with growth in the 1st century, in the face of violent opposition, and it was all based on this claim that Jesus was risen from the dead. And the very centre of the movement was Jerusalem, the place where all this is supposed to have happened. And so the question is, if Christianity was based on a fabricated lie of a tomb that wasn't really empty, how on earth did this movement begin and gain such credibility in the face of such opposition when all of the evidence was still at the fingertips of the people who would have wanted at all costs to stop this movement from growing? So there you have it, 5 pieces of evidence. Jesus died, he was buried, the tomb was reported empty, people claimed they had seen Jesus risen from the dead, and the church grew on this basis that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, what do you finish with? And I would suggest what you finish with is a resurrection-sized hole in the middle of history that only the resurrection will really fit. Now, that's not to say, of course, that people haven't tried to come up with alternatives. But what I've discovered is that the alternatives don't fit the evidence anywhere near as well as the original proposition. Let's have a think about it. What are the alternatives? Well, there aren't infinite amounts, but there are a number that have been put forward over the centuries. So let's have a quick look. Firstly, did Jesus really die? Some people say maybe he just passed out on the cross, he was put in the tomb, he came to, and then when he went out of the tomb, everyone thought he had risen from the dead. Okay, well, let's think. Firstly, you've got the problem with the Roman soldiers. They were very good at killing people. It was in their interest to make sure that Jesus was dead. If Jesus got away, they would have been killed in his place. That would be good incentive for most of us, wouldn't it? And we also know that when Jesus was dead, to check that he was dead, they thrust a spear into his side and were told that blood and water separates. That would have meant nothing to them, but for us with our medical knowledge, we know that was medical proof that death had in fact occurred. And then imagine somehow that Jesus still wasn't dead and that they had taken him off the cross. What you now have to believe is that Jesus was passed between lots of pairs of loving hands who would have all looked for signs of life and somehow missed it. And then he was wrapped in meters and meters of burial cloth that would have suffocated and kept him in a kind of straitjacket, as it were, and placed in a tomb. But then somehow Jesus in the tomb comes round and he manages to unwind himself from all the burial cloths. I'll wind myself up. And then he has to wind the burial cloths up again to look like he hasn't just done that. And then he pushes this stone that was a massive, probably 1,000 or more kilograms in weight, away from the entrance. He managed to run past the Roman guards without them seeing him. And then he turns up in the town, seeing the disciples, pretending that he's risen from the dead. Kind of stretches the credibility somewhat, particularly when we know that anyone who was crucified wouldn't be able to walk, let alone run, given the kind of torture that they had undergone. So that's the first thing. I don't think it really stands up. But here's another one. Some people say, well, maybe someone else died in Jesus' place. Maybe they got the wrong man. But again, you have to remember that Jesus had been publicly teaching in Jerusalem for 3 years before this event. And the followers of Jesus had very close access to him, as well as the enemies. He'd been there in the temple courts. It would have been very obvious who he was. And you would have think they would have taken special pains to make sure that they had got the right man. And if they had got the wrong man, well, something incredible has happened to this man because his grave is empty 3 days later. Well, it doesn't really work either. But what about this? Some people say, well, they went to the wrong tomb. You know, maybe they had got their iPhone and they were trying to use Apple Maps and it had got Jesus' tomb on the wrong place, like everything else on Apple Maps. Sorry. Or maybe, I heard someone say this, they said, well, you know, they are women after all, and they aren't very good at directions, are they, women? And I thought, I wouldn't say that, but, you know, that's what some people say. But again, you have to think, you know, you don't normally forget where you buried them. And then you've got to think that actually, they stuck Jesus in this tomb, and the women all went to the wrong tomb, and they went back to tell the disciples, the other guys, and they said, look, the tomb's empty. And they also, of course, went to the wrong tomb, and they repeatedly went to the wrong tomb. But imagine if that had happened, what would have happened when Peter, 40 days later, 50 days later, stands up and starts preaching about Jesus being risen from the dead. Jesus is alive, his tomb is empty. It would have been very easy to stop Christianity, wouldn't it? All you need to say is, excuse me, that That's not Jesus' tomb that's empty. That's Auntie Joanna's tomb, and she's been out of there for years. You numpties, you're all a load of fools. I mean, they would have just been the laughingstock of Jerusalem. No, I don't think they went to the wrong tomb. Well, here's another one. Maybe the body was stolen. Is it put forwards? Well, who would have stolen it? Culprit number one? Grave robbers. Well, hang on a minute. Why would grave robbers steal the body of someone who was known to have no material possessions other than his clothes, and they'd been given away, and then leave the only material possessions in the tomb, the grave clothes and the spices, and take the naked, blooded body away? I mean, I don't know what they were hoping to get for the body, but it doesn't seem particularly likely, particularly when there was a guard on the tomb as well. Okay, well, maybe the authorities did. Maybe they wanted to move Jesus to a safer place. Well, had the Jewish or Roman authorities done that? Again, you'd have to say, if they had done it, why didn't they produce the body when the disciples started preaching that Jesus was risen? And why not do that? It would have stopped the whole thing there and then. But they couldn't and they didn't. So I guess the most likely people to have done this would have been the disciples themselves. But then you've got to think, hang on, these disciples didn't appear to be expecting the resurrection in spite of what Jesus had said. And then you've got the problem of the Roman guard that was there precisely to stop the disciples coming from moving the body. And we had to try and get around that problem. But I think the most compelling argument is this. Almost every single one of the first Christian followers of Jesus died for their belief in the resurrection. Now, of course, it is sadly true that in history, people have died for things that are not true. But very, very rarely, if ever, will someone die for something that they know is not true. And if the disciples had made up this story because they had moved the body, then they would have known it wasn't true. And yet they kept the story to their dying deaths. I think that would have been very, very hard to kind of engineer. There's a guy called Chuck Colson who was in the White House administration at the time of Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. And Chuck Colson saw how under pressure people spilt the beans. They spoke about the truth because they wanted to protect themselves and they wanted the truth to be out. And he said, take it from one who was inside the Watergate web looking out, who saw firsthand how vulnerable a cover-up is. Nothing less than the witness as awesome as the resurrected Christ could have caused these men to maintain their dying whispers, that Jesus is alive and that he is Lord. He says, actually, this just wouldn't happen. The truth would have come out. But they never did. They kept it. And they kept, to their dying deaths, this belief that Jesus was risen. So was the body stolen or moved? No, I don't think it was. Well, here's one other one that I was told once. Someone said, well, maybe Jesus had a twin brother. And he was identical. And they got separated at birth, and the twin brother came back for the funeral. And the disciples mistook it for Jesus. Well, you would be surprised to hear that was put forward by a scholar in America in a public debate. But you don't need to be a scholar or American to realise that that's actually just doesn't really fit the evidence. I mean, what about the empty tomb? What about the body of Jesus that would have still been there had this happened? And why do we have no evidence? You see, what I think it shows is this. That in the light of the evidence, once you observe it, the alternatives become more incredible than the original proposition that Jesus rose from the dead. That actually, to believe the alternatives would require more faith, more blind faith, and more assumptions than actually to believe in the resurrection. And when you're willing to investigate it, you can find that is in fact the case. Has anyone heard of this guy? Sir Lionel Luckhoo? No? Didn't think so. But you might have heard of this guy. Anyone heard of this guy? Lionel Hutz in The Simpsons? Okay. Now the ironic thing is that Lionel Hutz in The Simpsons is based on the real life character Sir Lionel Luckhoo. So Lionel Hutz, or not Sir Lionel, just Lionel Hutz, you'll know, is the world's worst lawyer who has never won a case. But Lionel Luckhoo is in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's best lawyer because he's never lost a case. And this is what Sir Lionel Luckhoo says about the resurrection of Jesus. This is the real one. He says, I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubts. He's investigated it, it's compelling. And there are lawyers and historians who've come to the same conclusion, because they've checked it out for themselves? Well, in a moment we're going to look at the implications of this just for 5 minutes. Before that, we're going to have questions, and before that, we're just going to watch a very short video of someone else who made this investigation, a journalist and a skeptic who investigated for himself. So whilst the video's on, you might want to text in your questions if you haven't done that yet.
Well, for most of my life, I was an atheist. I thought the idea of an all-loving, all-powerful creator of the universe, I thought it was stupid. I mean, my background's in journalism and law. I tended to be a skeptical person. I was a legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. So I needed evidence before I believe anything. One day my wife came up to me. She had been agnostic. And she said after a period of spiritual investigation, she had decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ. And I thought, this is the worst possible news I could get. I thought she was going to turn into some sexually repressed prude who was going to spend all of her time serving the poor in Skid Row somewhere. I thought this was the end of our marriage. But in the ensuing months, I saw positive changes in her values, in her character, in the way she related to me and the children. It was winsome and it was attractive. And it made me want to check things out. So I went to church one day, mainly to try to see if I could get her out of this cult that she's gotten involved in. But I heard the message of Jesus articulated for the first time in a way that I could understand it. That forgiveness is a free gift. And that Jesus Christ died for our sins, that we might spend eternity with him. And I walked out saying, I was still an atheist, but also saying, if this is true, this has huge implications for my life. And so I used my journalism training and legal training to begin an investigation into whether there's any credibility to Christianity or to any other world faith system for that matter. I did that for 1 year and 9 months until November the 8th of 1981. And on that day, I realized that in light of the torrent of evidence flowing in the direction of the truth of Christianity, it would require more faith for me to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. Because to be an atheist, I would have to swim upstream against this torrent of evidence pointing toward the truth of Jesus Christ. And I couldn't do that. I was trained in journalism and law to respond to truth. And so on that day, I received Jesus Christ as my forgiver and as my leader. And just like with my wife, my life began to change over time. My values, my character, the purpose of my life began to be transformed over time in a way that, as I look back, I can't imagine staying on the path I was on compared to the adventure and the fulfillment and the joy of following Jesus Christ.
Awesome. Fantastic. Okay, so that's Lee Strobel, and if you want to hear more from him, there's a book from him on the bookstore called The Case for Christ, which is a recounting of his investigation. It takes a bit more than 2 minutes to read, but you'll find it helpful if you want to make that investigation too. Now, hopefully we've got some questions. I'll put the number back up so you can text in if you haven't. Great.
Okay. I'm just reading.
Okay.
Here, the first.
First question.
The first question is there evidence outside the Bible? And how can we take the Bible as evidence?
Okay, is there evidence outside the Bible? How can we take the Bible as evidence? Often that's a question people ask me because they say, well, look, a lot of what you're saying is from the Bible. How can you... Sorry? Okay, sorry. A lot of the evidence that you've cited is from the Bible. How can you take that? Is there evidence outside of the Bible? Well, let's take the Bible for a start. There's a mistake that some Christians make with the Bible, and that's to say, the Bible must be true because it's the Bible. And most of us would look at that and say, well, that's just a circular argument, isn't it? You just give this special treatment, and we shouldn't just give it special treatments. But there's an equal and opposite mistake that I find that other people can make, and that is to say, I'm never going to read the Bible or accept it as evidence because it's the Bible. And I'd say, well, that would be also a circular argument, but just of the opposite kind. What you want to say is, okay, I shouldn't necessarily accept or reject the Bible, but I should put it on the level of any other historical evidence in history. And I need to ask those historical questions about its reliability, about the manuscript's evidence and the traditions, about how accurate it's been preserved, and about the motivations and the reasons of writing of the first writers. And then I need to compare it with the other evidence to see whether it fits, whether it contradicts, whether there's something that gives me reason to doubt it. And as I do that, I need to make up my mind, is this credible historical evidence or not? Now, I have found that as I've looked into the Gospel accounts, there are many, many good reasons to take the New Testament and the Gospel accounts as reliable historical evidence. Not just on a par with other sources from antiquity, but actually even more so given the weight of evidence that we have for it. So I would say don't dismiss the Bible. You don't have to accept it as God's word yet, of course not. But you can at least look into it as a historical text and say, is this something worth looking into? I think there are many good reasons to say that it has been accurately preserved and it's reliably telling us what happens. If you've got doubts, though, get the book on the bookstore called Why Trust the Bible? Kind of the clues in the name, what it's about. And that will give you lots more opportunity to investigate that. Is there evidence outside of the Bible for the resurrection? Well, actually, what you've got is, in the fifth piece of evidence there, is the massive growth of Christianity in the first century. Suddenly you've got Jews and Roman Greek people who are massively changing their worldview and their beliefs about life after death in the face of hostility and opposition for what? And someone said, actually, if you take away the resurrection, you've got to give some alternative explanation for what so massively changed these people. You know, for a Jewish person to believe that Jesus was the Messiah after this Messiah figure had been crucified by their enemies on a Roman cross, ashamed and cursed death, would have taken something absolutely cataclysmic and massive, like the resurrection, to change their mindsets on that. We've also got the writings of other historians that talk about the possibility of the resurrection, that Christians claim that the resurrection had happened. It's worth saying, of course, that everyone, when they writes with a motive and a reason. Now, most of the Roman and Jewish historians weren't writing primarily with the reason of recounting the life of Jesus. They referred to it as it had implication on other events that they were talking about. And of course, if you were a Jew who didn't choose to follow Jesus, then you might have good reasons for not wanting to speak much about the resurrection of Christ and try and keep this quiet. So you've got to bear that in mind as well. What I think is fascinating is the lack of any competing claim from the first century. That in the face of this rapid movement of Christianity, no one is able to stop it, when it would have been very easy to had it been based on a lie. Because Christianity is different from other religions. It's not a private vision or a private experience that's been privately passed on. It's a public event. Jesus, his life, death and resurrection, that is publicly witnessed and then publicly spoken about in the face of opposition. And so it's worth looking into all of those things. But it's a great question. Okay, have you got another question?
How do we know that the Roman soldiers did thrust a spear into the side of Jesus?
Okay, how do we know that the Roman soldiers thrust a spear into the side of Jesus? Because we have the account written within some of the Gospel accounts. So again, some people would say, well, I'm just not going to accept it because it's in the Bible. Well, okay, hang on a minute. You need to stop and say, well, are there reasons for accepting the biblical accounts? And I think one of the interesting things is that actually the detail that blood and water separated was quite an inconsequential detail for them at that time. They wouldn't have known what that meant as such. Of course, given later medical advances and knowledge, we know that that's actually quite a significant detail, though that wouldn't have been for them. So there weren't, in any sense, kind of motives in writing that other than that it was a detail of what happens, which is interesting. Yeah, great.
Maybe you can't cover up the resurrection, but maybe you could cover up the Gospels later in the history.
Maybe you can't cover up the resurrection, but maybe you could cover up the Gospels later in history. I guess the question, if I get this wrong, come and talk to me afterwards, I'd happily chat, but I guess it may be referring to other Gospel accounts, possibly, or the Gospels have been changed in some way. Now, we do have other Gospels, inverted commas, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, things like that. Why don't we accept them? Very good reason, in that they were all written much later. They date from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They were written by a Christian cult influenced by Greek thought called the Gnostics, and they are generally regarded by historians, Christian and non-Christian alike, as being very unreliable as any historical source for the life of Jesus. And they're very different. I mean, I've got them at home. You can read them. There's no cover-up. You can check it out. They're kind of weird. They sound a bit like some kid that grew up going to church and then later in life went away from church and took drugs, and one night, high on drugs, tried to remember what they learned about Jesus. It's kind of some of the stories about Jesus mixed in with some really weird stuff, like Jesus having the head the size of a planet. And so you can read it, but actually no one really regards these as good historical sources. They tell you a bit about, Gnostic people in the 2nd century, but not a lot about Jesus. What about the Gospels, though? What we know about the Gospels is that, in comparison with other sources and other books from history, their transmission, the way it's been passed down, has been far more carefully done than any other book. We've got manuscripts of the Gospels that date from within 50 years of their time of writing, which is up to 10 times, 20 times less than other books from that time. And we've got a whole mountain of evidence, over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament from that early periods that we can compare together to check that what we've got is accurate. So I think actually what we've got in the Gospels is good evidence, it's reliable, and it's the best stuff that we've got to look at. Brilliant. Any others?
Yeah, when are the Gospels written? Did the authors live at the time of Jesus? And how can I know that the Bible is true?
Okay, when did the Gospels get written? Did they live at the time of Jesus? They were written, the 4 Gospels in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, in a period between 50 and 90 AD. Mark was probably written first. That seems to be generally regarded as the earliest. John probably the last. We don't know exactly. They didn't put dates at the top of their books. So we can't, I'm not going to kind of die for my belief that they were written on that day. But I think we've got good reason to think that they were written within a generation. And John's Gospel, the last one to be written, we've got a manuscript of that from 120 AD in Egypt. Far, far away from where it was originally written. So good reasons for saying actually they were written within a lifetime, which is important, isn't it? Because if they were fabricating and making up their stories, then how did these stories get believed and accepted? And the eyewitnesses of Jesus would have still been alive to corroborate or to contradict what these people were saying. And that's really key. Yeah.
Is Christianity all about finding the truth? Why do we need to know it's true?
Is Christianity all about finding the truth? Do we need to know it's true? Great question, and it's one that I'm asked repeatedly, particularly here in Denmark. Can't we just say, it's just nice? And I would say actually no, because if it's not true, it's not nice. Actually, in the New Testament, one of the early Christian leaders called Paul said, if the resurrection of Jesus did not happen, then our faith is futile and Christians are to be pitied more than anyone else because their faith is an illusion and it's based on a lie. And I don't want to build my life on an illusion or a lie. I want to build it on something that's true. And the great thing about Christianity is you can find out whether it is true or not because it's based on something so objective as the resurrection. And so I would say it's absolutely important to find out whether it's true or not. In a kind of public, objective sense, not just in a private, kind of nice for me kind of way. And so I would say, yes, you can investigate it. And if it's not true, objectively so, let's close down our churches, let's sack our ministers, they can go and get another job, we can turn them into something else, because we shouldn't keep this going. Okay? I don't want to live my life based on an illusion. And I don't think you would either. And, you might say, well, the illusion makes you feel happy, but imagine I have this, illusion of an imaginary friend that is actually my wife. You might say, well, it makes you happy. But I would say, actually, I want you to slap me around the face and tell me it's an illusion. Because I want to be living in reality, not in a dream world. And Christianity's claim is that we're basing this on reality, not just a dream world that's real. Yeah, absolutely. Any others? Probably time for one more.
Other people have come back from death, even people in the Bible like Lazarus. So how could Jesus' death be different?
Okay, other people have come back from death, even people in the Bible. How could Jesus' death be different? There are, of course, people in the Bible. Lazarus was raised to life by Jesus, a 12-year-old girl we read about, and also a young boy in the Gospel accounts. So what happened to Jesus? Was it just kind of the same? Well, I would say there's a key difference. What happened to those people was technically you might call resuscitation, in that they were brought back to life, but they died again. I always thought Lazarus' family were kind of unlucky. They had to pay for 2 funerals, not just one. These guys died again. They hadn't conquered death. They simply came back to live a bit longer. But the unique thing about Jesus' death is not resuscitation, but it's resurrection. And it's a conquering of death, a victory over death. And Jesus says, look, because he is risen from the death, he's not going to die again. And if we trust in him, that can be our hope too. And so there's something categorically quite different about the resurrection of Jesus. And it's also something that we can investigate objectively. So when people say, well, there was this person in such and such a place, and I heard that someone said, maybe, I want to say, well, look, let's investigate that. Let's put that down. And do that with the resurrection, because I think what you have in the resurrection is the most compelling evidence of all to investigate. Okay? Great. Are there more? There might be some more, but I think we might have to, unless there's some really good... Okay, great. If you've got more, by all means, keep discussing it later or come and talk to me. But what I wanted to do, just before we finish, is say, look, we've looked at all of this, but what difference does that make? I mean, you may love history, you may not love history. If you don't love history, you've probably been quite bored for some of this evening, because you're thinking, well, doesn't really turn me on, it doesn't excite me. But actually, if Jesus rose from the dead, it makes all the difference in the world. So let me just share very briefly 4 differences that the resurrection would make if it's true. Firstly, it would mean the future is certain. In the New Testament, in a book called Acts, we're told about how Paul, a Christian leader, spoke in the city of Athens. And at the end of his talk to a group of philosophers and thinkers, he said this: God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed. And he's given proof of it to everyone by raising him from the dead. What he says is that there is a day of judgments in the future, and the proof of it is an event that has already taken place in the past, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That Jesus is that judge that all of history will stand before. If the resurrection happens, then we know where history is heading. And there is a judgment to come, which in one sense, as we looked at lunchtime, is a good thing, because it means there is justice to come. And when I look at the horrors and the injustices and the evil of this world, I am very glad that there is a day of justice coming. But of course the question is, if Jesus is the one that I'm going to stand before, what about me if I've spent my life rejecting him? And in the face of the worry of that, some of us might just want to bury our head in the sand and say, I'm just not going to think about it. I remember a few years ago I was driving from my house in Bournemouth to other parts of England, and I was speaking at a church, believe it or not, because as I was going along the road, I was going along a big main road at, we have miles per hour because we're weird, but I was going at 70 miles per hour, and I came around the corner and there was a big red circle with a number 50 in it, and next to it there was a policeman, and he was pointing one of those speed guns at me, and my heart kind of sank. And I looked at the policeman, I looked at the speed sign. By this point, of course, so I was about 500 metres down the road. And I looked as the policeman was getting into his car, putting on his blue flashing lights, and was pulling out into the road behind me. Now, I have to confess, because I was on my way to church to preach at the time, the first thought that came into my mind at this moment was, if you floor it, you can beat him. Like, seriously, I thought, put your foot down, Michael, you can get round the corner, you'll be off, no problem. And then I thought, don't be stupid. He's already got my number, and I'm going to be in trouble sooner or later. Better to pull over now and face up to the consequences than to keep on going and face even more serious consequences later on. Now, it's a silly illustration, and sadly it happened, but if Jesus rose from the dead, and if he is the judge I'm going to stand before one day, wouldn't it be rather unwise just to ignore this and hope it goes away? Wouldn't it be more wise to at least think it through and think about what that might mean and at least check it out? See, it means the future is certain. Secondly, it means the past can be forgiven. For some of us, we might think, well, if this is true, I'm in trouble. I'm screwed. Because I've spent most of my life kind of ignoring Jesus. Maybe explicitly, you've called yourself an atheist, or just implicitly, you just say, well, I don't really care. And if this is true, then actually, I'm in trouble. Because actually, when we're honest, as we looked at on Tuesday night, we look in our lives and see that all is not right, and, well, how could God really accept me? But the resurrection is great news, because it means that all that Jesus died to accomplish has been accomplished. The Bible says Jesus died on the cross to take what we deserve, to take the punishment, the separation from God that we rightly deserve because we've rejected God and gone our own way. But Jesus says, I'm dying to take your place. Against all the odds, I can accept you back and you can have a relationship with me again. But how do we know that's true? How do we know that's not just make-believe? And the answer is the resurrection. It's, as it were, the receipt that proves the payment of the cross really worked. You know, like when you go into a shop, you pay with your credit card. Embarrassing moments of discovering that my credit card has been declined. And you get that piece of paper saying void. And so you only really know the payment's been accepted when the receipt rolls and it says paid. And how do we know that Jesus really did deal with the wrong and the rubbish of my life and yours? And the resurrection is the receipts. It says that Jesus really did do enough to make it possible that against everything that we might imagine, that God would willingly take us back. He would forgive us. He would say, in spite of whatever we've done, we're welcome. Which is such great news. The future's certain, the past can be forgiven. Thirdly, today matters. At the beginning, we said there are different views about the future. You know, some people say, well, death is the end. And if death is the end, well, what is the point of today? You know, what is the point of everything I work for and accomplish and strive for if ultimately it's going to count for nothing? But if Jesus rose from the dead, the Bible says the implications of that are huge. Because it means that I won't go to a spiritual paradise called heaven, but that God is going to make a new world right here. That he's going to redeem and transform this broken world and make it right again. And if God's going to transform this world and these bodies, if we trust in Jesus, then it means that what we do now does matter, because it's not just going to be destroyed in the future. It's going to be redeemed and made new. So all of life now matters, not just going to church and singing songs, but everything in life. You know, your studies and your knowledge, your relationships and your friendships, you know, your hobbies, your sports, your art, culture, everything matters because Jesus rose from the dead. Life is worth living because it's not heading to destruction and annihilation. It's heading to redemption and hope. Life is worth living because the future is certain. Today matters. And then finally, there is hope. If Jesus rose from the dead, then death is not something we need to fear. But actually, beyond death, there is the greatest hope of all. Joni Eareckson Tada was an athletic teenage girl living in the United States. And one day she jumped into a lake near her house and dived into it headfirst, only to find that the water was too shallow. She hit the bottom, her neck was broken in several places, and she spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair as a quadriplegic, unable to move from the neck down. But as a Christian, after grappling and struggling with this for her whole life, she says, I can scarcely believe it. I, with shriveled, bent fingers, atrophied muscles, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling. Can you imagine the hope this gives someone spinal cord injured like me, or someone who is cerebral palsied or brain injured? Imagine the hope this gives to someone who's manic depressive. No other religion, no other philosophy promises new bodies, hearts, and minds. Only in the gospel of Christ do hurting people find such incredible hope. I challenge you to find a hope so real and so beautiful as that. And it's not too good to be true. It's so good because it is true. A few years ago, when I was growing up in a different part of England, I got to know a guy called Barry, which is a very kind of English name. And he was married to his wife, called Paula, and they had 3 children. We worked together for the summer, and then I moved away to college in Scotland. But I got news a few months later that Paula, Barry's wife, had been diagnosed with cancer. She went for treatments and chemotherapy, but despite the best treatment possible, it didn't make any difference. And eventually the doctors gave her the sad news. There was nothing more that they could do. They said that they expected that she would live for 3 months, but she actually didn't last much more than a month. And I'll never forget Paula's funeral service. It was in a little church just outside Leicester, the city where I lived, and it was absolutely filled with people, her family, her husband, her children, her parents, her neighbours and her friends, all of them packed in with standing room only. And then they brought the coffin into the church at the start of the service. And as they did that, a song was played over the loudspeakers. Now, it was a song that many of the people would have known before, but the reason why everyone sat up and listened is that the person who was singing the song was Paula. You see, she had recorded it just a couple of weeks before her death, knowing that she was going to die. And she sang these words to that congregation. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I'll stand. You see, what we've looked at tonight is not just historical, interesting events. If it's true, it makes the biggest difference in the world, in life and in death and in eternity. And it's real. And my question to you is, what are you going to make of it? Maybe you are a skeptic. This week has been for you. It's been Skeptic Week. And maybe you still consider yourself as a bit of a skeptic. You know, there was a guy in the Bible that was a skeptic. He was called Thomas. He was as skeptical as they come. And when he heard about the resurrection, his reaction was, rubbish. I'm not going to believe in that. Unless I see with my eyes, unless I touch him with my hands, I'm not going to believe. And yet a week later, he did see with his eyes. He did touch with his hands. He did believe. And Jesus said to him something very interesting. He said, blessed are you because you've seen and believed, but more blessed are those who don't see and yet believe. Now, what is Jesus saying? Is he commending blind faith? Is he comparing faith and reason and saying that we need to summon up faith against all the evidence? No. He's not comparing faith and reason, he's comparing faith and science. Thomas believed because he could see. We cannot see Jesus, but we can still have good reasons for believing. And in fact, John, who records the story, says in the very next sentence, our reasons for believing are that we have, well, all of the eyewitness accounts and all of the evidence of 2,000 years of history and all of the transformed lives that Jesus has brought about, right down to the present day and many sitting in this room. We have all of that to go on. Our faith is not irrational. It's not by sight, but it's very reasonable. And Thomas said to Jesus this, he said, my Lord and my God. Very simple statements, but very profound. He didn't simply say, oh, you are the Lord, you are God, but he said, you're mine. He personalized it. And that's really what it means to start following Jesus. It means taking objective truths, but making them personal for yourself. And I wonder whether there are some tonight that are ready to do that. Now, you might be saying, well, I've still got all these questions and these doubts and everything else. Well, that's fair enough. That's okay. But where should you become a Christian? Should you become a Christian when you've got every question sewn up and all your doubts answered and you have 100%? Well, actually, that's not what we do in most things in life. Yeah, if you're going to do that, you'll probably never get married because you'll never know for 100%. But it's not irrational. You make that decision that says, actually, given what I know, it would be more reasonable to do this than to do this. And for some of you, you know that. To actually reject all this would be a bigger leap of faith. And hey, why not bring your doubts to Jesus and be honest and say, Jesus, I'm not absolutely sure, but I think I'm sure. And if you're there, please help me with the questions that I still have. Maybe you think, well, what would other people say? If I say I've become part of this God squad and followed Jesus. I don't know about in Denmark, but it doesn't do much good for your cred in England if you say you started following Jesus. But hey, the point is this. If it's true, it's worth following whatever the cost. And if your friends are going to reject you because you've chosen to do this, I'm not sure how great they were as friends anyway. Or maybe you say, well, my problem is I just don't know whether I could keep it up. I couldn't live as a Christian. And of course you wouldn't be able to on your own. But you're not having to, because the Bible says if we follow Jesus, then Jesus himself, by his unseen self, his Spirit, comes to live within us, to help us, to give us the power to live the way he wants us to. You're not on your own, and you can never do it on your own anyway. Or maybe you're saying, well, look, I just don't feel it. I need to feel it before I'm going to do anything about it. I say to people like that, I say, well, hang on a minute. Imagine you were about to get married, but you said, before I get married, I need to feel married. And until I feel married, I'm not going to get married. And I would say you're going to be waiting a long time, mates, because you're only going to feel married when you get married, aren't you? And if you want to feel the reality of Jesus in your life, then ask him to come into your life. And he will. And it will change things. But it's not an act primarily of the emotions, it's an act of your will and your mind. And so I'm not appealing to your emotions on some emotional appeal. I'm just saying, if you're convinced that actually this is more reasonable than the alternatives, and this is true, to do something about it and to take that step. Well, how can you do it? Well, before I finish, I'm just going to say a very short prayer. And I would just want to invite anyone who's come to the point this week of saying, I'm ready to do something about this, to pray this as well. Not out loud, you don't have to stand up, just where you're sitting in your hearts. But as a way of saying to God, I want to get serious and I want to respond to the invitation of this forgiveness and this hope. And the wonderful news is that if you are willing to do that, then God is willing to answer that. So I'm going to pray. If you don't want to pray, that's absolutely fine. And don't do it if you don't mean it. I mean, the church has got enough hypocrites in without any more joining. So please just do this if you're serious about it, okay? Yeah, if not, just listen and we'll finish in a second. But if you are serious, well, this is going to be helpful for you. So let's just have a moment and then I will pray. God, I am sorry that I've often lived my life without you, going my own way. Thank you that you came in Jesus and lived and died and rose again for me so that I could be accepted back by you. God, please, will you forgive me? Will you come and take control in my life? And will you give me this hope through life and through death and into eternity, I pray. Amen. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for putting up with this English guy coming and talking to you in this weird language all week. You've been very gracious in coming along, so thank you so much. Before I finish, and I really will...